Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast, and I'm joined today by Dave, my friend, and one of our pastors here at Fellowship Denver. Dave, thanks for being here on the podcast with me.
Thanks for having me on, and I'm excited for this conversation.
I feel compelled, because Hunter's not here with us today, just you and me, to say something about your wardrobe.
Okay,
this is usually something that Hunter does. He comments on my wardrobe, so I don't really know how to do it, though. This isn't a skill I've curated, but
right. And let me just say, it's probably inappropriate generally just to comment on what people are wearing. Can I just put that out there? But go ahead, Autumn.
Thanks. I'm just going to charge ahead anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I just want to point out you're wearing a Boston College hoodie, which is very appropriate for our conversation today.
It is.
Yeah, that's really what I wanted to say. We're going to talk about the church and higher education, and so you're representing.
That's right. And I'm wearing sweats as well. So just trying to summon all of the feelings of what it felt like to be in college and grad school. So.
We have not opted to go the way that some podcasts have gone, in that they are also producing video content, simultaneously with audio content. And I, for one, am really grateful for that. So we'll just leave people with that mental image,
That's right.
Dave's got on tennis shoes, sweats, Boston College hoodie.
Yep. And just to be clear, if it was video, I would still be wearing the exact same thing. I
Absolutely.
I'm probably pretty unalterable when it comes to things like that, despite people's requests to me to dress a little bit fancier.
Well, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. We are going to talk about the church and higher education and Christian higher ed over the course of several discussions, and you'll be joining me on those. And I'm excited about the opportunity to discuss this. We've been compelled towards this discussion by a number of things. We were just commenting right before this that one is our personal state. You have now, your oldest is in his freshman year at college. I have a junior who's headed towards college. So we've been contemplating it as parents. And then you also have been involved in the world of higher education for quite a while. And you recently launched something at Fellowship Denver called Fellowship Institute. So you've actually been thinking about some of the things we're going to discuss here on the podcast for quite a while. Will you give us a sense, Dave, of where we're going to go in this series of conversations?
Sure. Well, what we have looking forward in this series of podcasts is really what's caused us to focus on the church and higher ed is, Autumn, something that we've observed, and it's not just us, our church and leadership, and it's been broader than that, of course, as well. But over the past several years, the apparent lack of deep formation that's become pretty ubiquitous, not just in church people, in society at large, when there are these big cultural kind of movements and ups and downs of society and kind of the whiplash that many people have experienced. What kind of comes to the surface is whether or not people have been formed, whether or not there's actual virtue that exists. And historically, the role of the university, the role of seminary, the role of education is to shape and form people at such a level that they can withstand the ups and downs of cultural shifts. Even the word seminary, the root word for seminary is the word seed, which means rooted. The whole point is for someone to be rooted, deep roots, so that when there are shifts in society, they actually remain stable. They have access to God's Spirit and His Word, and their stability with the person who's been trained. That's unique among maybe the rest of the population. That's why, you train someone who's going to be in those positions of leadership or what have you. So we've just kind of noticed that at a certain university level, culturally, where there's been this lack of virtue that's come to the surface in the populace, and then even at the Christian higher ed and seminary level, there's been we've had a great testing of the effectiveness of Christian higher ed, and we're just observing with our own eyeballs. Is it effective? Like, has it actually been proven to work? Have leaders been rooted or not in these times? And kind of spoiler alert, I think the answer to that has been mostly discouraging. Not 100% discouraging, which we're going to get into. Mm-hmm. And it's not leading us to make conclusions about the role of higher ed in the church and the use of higher ed in the kingdom of God. And I'm empathetic as to why some people might be totally distrustful of the institutions themselves. I get it. That's not us. Spoiler alert. The next several podcasts will sort of play that out as we interview leaders of Christian higher ed major institutions, and yet we are just having to respond to what we see in our own church. And so the birth of Fellowship Institute is really a response to the needs within our own local congregation. Are we forming disciples at a depth that is needed in order to withstand all of the ups and downs and pressures that society faces? So Fellowship Institute is just that. We call it a mold. It is a place where we will mold followers of Jesus, men and women who want to follow Jesus, and using a classroom environment to shape them in such a way that they can become fruitful, faithful disciples at every stage of their life. Like, that's really the point of Fellowship Institute. So that's sort of where Fellowship Institute comes to came to mind, and why we're doing it in relationship with higher ed.
I really like that image, Dave, of being rooted. I think that's so helpful. You mentioned that that's even in the name seminary, that's what it's supposed to connote, is that we're grounding people, we're rooting people, we're giving them a solid foundation. And this is a part of what we hope to do through Fellowship Institute. You mentioned another term, mold. It's to really have a shaping effect such that because we want to grow deep roots, we can withstand whatever's happening around us. And I think there's a really positive vision in that. We're going to unpack some of the problems we see and return to that question that you just asked a moment ago. Is it working? What do we see going on in higher ed? And is it working? So we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But before we do, you've got a lot of experience in this whole world of higher ed, both personally and then as a teacher in various institutions. And so I want to ask you first about some of that. If you'd share some of your story with us, and then let us know your current involvement in higher ed and how all of that kind of sequentially, both your own experience, what you're observing is going on, your experience within the world of higher ed has led you to decide that a forming, shaping institutional presence, such as Fellowship Institute, that takes place through the church is really necessary for what this moment is asking and what we see going on culturally in higher ed and then within the church, as you've mentioned. So to your story, what was your own degree track? What was your own personal firsthand experience within the world of higher ed?
Well, my college experience, I went to Oklahoma Baptist University, a private liberal arts university. And the more I reflect on it, the more grateful I am for my undergrad. I don't think I appreciated it when I was going through it, and probably didn't really appreciate it for several years after. But it was a university experience that was liberal arts in its essence. It taught virtue. I learned literature and history, Western civilization and virtue formation. I had multiple classes that were taught by two different professors at the same time, multidisciplinary. And so it was very classically liberal arts, teaching virtue. The degree that I got, it was a very well-respected degree called communications. And people make fun of me, for that degree. Fellow communications majors out there, shout out. Even though that degree isn't terribly marketable, what I appreciate about those 4 years is that I was taught civic engagement. I was taught the role of education, not just towards a profession, but towards what it means to be a part of a broader community. That was all my undergrad. That was the real value of it. So from there, though, in terms of vocational training, I knew I wanted to go into ministry. So I went to Dallas Seminary. I did a THM, so it was a 4-year, 120-hour master's program. It's like an MDiv plus an MA together. So it was a very girthy 4-year program that when we talk about mold and shaping, Dallas Seminary at the time was just that. It taught a particular theology that many of the aspects of that theology I don't actually adhere to personally, but it almost didn't matter because it had a theology that was coherent. I was actually shaped in it and had an understanding of all of Scripture and the theology and all the languages sort of behind it, that it still did the molding effect in me, as someone who wanted to go into ministry, that I could adjust some of the specifics. No institution's perfect. Every institution has its quirks, of course. But because the mold was there, I, looking back, can appreciate how I was shaped by it, how I understand the role of Scripture and in church ministry in particular and teaching, and everything kind of built on that foundation. My last year of seminary, I ended up getting awarded this overseas research fellowship for further academic studies. So from there, then, Renee and we moved to Cambridge, England, and I was a research fellow at Cambridge University in historical Jesus studies. There was the first time I had a lot of really significant engagement with kind of high-level scholars who had written a lot of the books that I'd read in seminary. And these people were heroes of mine. So to pursue a PhD, to pursue maybe the possibility of teaching at a university or seminary, was an intrigue it was interesting to me. Now, at the same time, at the very end of seminary, that's when Renee and I had Hunter over, and God clearly called us to plant Fellowship Denver sort of in the midst of this kind of academic higher ed sort of environment and ambition even. So for me, planting Fellowship Denver and academic pursuits have always gone hand in hand. It's never been opposed to each other. They've always kind of fed off each other. So whatever the academic stuff that I would do in my mind, even when we were at Cambridge, and then after Cambridge, I decided, okay, let's do a PhD. So moved up to Durham in northern England, where I studied with John Barclay, who had moved up there, and N.T. Wright was up there as well. So it was this really amazing opportunity. All of that academic stuff was really to service whatever it is that God was doing and planting this church, Fellowship Denver. So moved up to England, stayed there for a couple of years, moved back to America, to Denver, to start Fellowship Denver. My status was changed to part-time as I finished my PhD. And then the first 3 years of Fellowship Denver was also, as we were planting, I'm also finishing my PhD. which isn't recommended. And at any point along the way, it could have easily either one of those pursuits and callings could have easily been extinguished. But God was very kind and kind of preserved both of those efforts. So when Fellowship in Denver was really established, self-sustaining, was around the same time I finished my PhD, and then within months after finishing, I took a job as a seminary professor, just teaching one class, as well as being a full-time pastor here. So I've really now for 13, 14 years, I've been, for the most part, I've taught a class every semester somewhere, and then I've been teaching pastor here at Fellowship. So again, both of these pursuits and both of these sort of worlds have kind of been together in me and kind of been in our culture and our environment, I think, at Fellowship for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Outside of Fellowship Institute, where do you currently teach?
Yes. So it's kind of fun. My first job that I got was at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary, Rocky Mountain campus. Mm-hmm. So it's a mouthful. The guy who hired me is going to be a guest on this series of podcast, Earl Wagner. He is now Dean of the Graduate School for Christian Education at Colorado Christian University. So we're going to have him on. But he hired me as a New Testament prof. And then from there, I started also teaching at Denver Seminary. And I've taught New Testament there for years with Craig Blomberg, sort of took me under his wing, and I taught a class for him for the longest time. So I'm still associate faculty at Denver Seminary. I'm not teaching currently there, and we can talk about that, why I'm not, in terms of remote versus in-person learning a little bit later on. But I'm also teaching now for a new seminary called Tenet School of Theology. And we're going to have the founder of that seminary also on this show,
yes,
Michael Morgan. And we're going to talk about how he's addressing some of the formation needs that are evident in leaders of churches and ministries now, and how Tenet is trying to address some of those needs in the format of their seminary. So I teach for them as well. All of this, of course, is just one class a semester, but yeah, that's my current involvement.
Mm. So since beginning your time as an undergrad, you've existed continuously in the world of higher ed, and you went from doing PhD work to teaching.
That's right. You know, many of us have this recurring nightmare where it's the end of a semester and we realize we've forgotten to show up for class.
Yeah.
And we have all this work to do, some version of that nightmare. I still have that nightmare, except it's changed to where it's a finals day, and I'm supposed to deliver the final, and I've forgotten to write the final. And so in my dream, this recurring dream, I always have the class do some sort of classroom project while I quickly type up the final for them to take. So yeah, I haven't had a break from the higher ed, the tyranny of higher ed.
Yeah. Dave, I have one more question for you, just about your personal experience. How has your own education, so going to Oklahoma Baptist, then Dallas Theological Seminary, and then completing your PhD in Durham, how have you seen the impact of your own education present, especially in your pastoral ministry? And because all of that, the conclusion of your formal schooling and planting Fellowship existed simultaneously, and then you've, as we've discussed, you've continued in this world in a teaching role, also alongside being a pastor. So, what particular value have you seen born out of your own educational track then as you stepped into pastoral ministry, and what's been the lasting impact of that?
I think I can answer that in a lot of different ways, because I think there are multiple sort of values and fruit that have come from that experience that I've had and privilege that I've been given. The first one that comes to mind, though, in terms of how it has impacted sort of our experience at church, is the pursuit of a PhD in particular equips you with the capacity for research. And now my research topic, no one ever asks me about that. I very rarely get an opportunity to sort of go back to my actual things that I've studied. But the habits and even the kind of the know-how to get to that depth of understanding, all that's available for other topics. And so the things that we actually deal with in church leadership, the issues that we face, the cultural stuff, the background has given me a kind of confidence and a kind of know-how that, hey, I don't know the answers to these questions, but I kind of know how to get to the bottom of it, and I kind of know what it feels like to at least have some sense of being able to handle where the major tensions are and where some people will go way too far one direction or the other, and where like the roadblocks are, and when the academic experience has kind of taught me through trial and error how to like discern that process, if that makes sense. So yeah. I think that's really a big one, because we're always facing new issues, but being able to get to a bottom of an issue, it erases the anxiety to have to be the first to have a hot take on something. It actually makes me, and I think us generally as a church culture, we're very disinterested in having to have a hot take on any cultural issue on the front end. But it does give us the patience maybe to have the last word on something, or the word that is maybe hopefully most rooted and connected to transcendent wisdom and can stabilize a community sort of at a deeper level, whereas on the surface there's chaos, but you can kind of get down to a level to where you can find some real stability. So I credit sort of the molding impact of all of those levels of education to kind of giving the tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, I think it's, from my vantage point, it's what you're saying, and through telling us your story and then getting to experience you as one of my pastors and as a coworker and friend, I think I see the type of rootedness and shaping effect that you've described present then in the way that you actually pastor, in the way you talk to and counsel people, and in the way you teach. It seems to me I would characterize what you've described as saying it gave you a deep confidence in God's word, written and in the living word of God in Christ. And when you dig down into an issue and get to the essence of it, that confidence always remains. And so as a friend and coworker who gets to experience you in that way, that gives me a lot of confidence as well in Scripture. So I can see that. I can see how what God used in your life as far as your school track has impacted fellowship. And I'm really grateful for it. But you're the perfect person to have these conversations with, too, because you've had this longevity now in the world of higher ed and in Christian higher ed. And so I think now I want to shift us into asking, okay, so Dave, you've existed in this world, and I can make some observations about it. I mentioned already, I'm a parent. I'm looking towards college with my daughter, who is looking at colleges. So we're in that cycle now, looking at colleges, visiting colleges. So I can look at it from that perspective. I can also see how universities, just kind of at large, are represented in the media. So that's a narrative that I have in my mind. And so I can observe all of those things. You have a different vantage point from within it. But I think that all of this is of interest, not only to me, but also to our listeners, because of the higher level discussion, because of the media discussion, and because of the pressures that the church faces. And so the alignment of the two actually does impact us as a local church body to, depending on your personal situation, to some extent, maybe to a smaller degree, maybe to a greater degree. But I'm excited to hear kind of your assessment of the state of higher ed, and then to talk about how we can really thoughtfully respond and engage. So how would you characterize, kind of, just if we start at a real high level, and then we'll kind of bring it down in just a moment, but how would you characterize the state of higher education in America? That's a huge question, but I'm just wondering, like, what is as you think through this, what's your summary?
Well, it's hard to summarize because there are so many different aspects of higher ed today. But at a super kind of high level kind of assessment, I would say that universities generally, from what I've seen, kind of going through this experience, have maybe lost or maybe never had a full vision of their role in shaping young people who go through their institutions. They've kind of lost the purpose or the vision of shaping them to produce a particular kind of student or graduate that makes a kind of difference in the world. Instead, rather than looking at the whole sort of person, I think it's become so sectioned off and divided, so almost vocationally focused, and even using the term vocation, I think, is a generous term. Training people to do a job to make money is probably more accurate. So it's become so functional that the more broader character forming aspect of a university experience is lost or altogether, or it's the secondary, or it's not really the purpose of why the institution exists. So I think because of that, the general populace of people who have graduated, what we see is a product of people who haven't really been changed, or people who their primary influences haven't been going through university. Their primary influences are now so many other things that their college education is just, fifth or sixth or seventh place. So the value of it societally just isn't what it used to be.
The value is diminishing. Those are some of the things, what you're saying there are some of the things we can observe, because of the current outcome. Perhaps that's in the students that are being turned out of universities, but some of that is due to, I think, debt that is incurred. Some of it is due to the fact that students are turned out and are ill-prepared. Maybe they're prepared to do a certain job, maybe not, but they're not prepared to enter the workplace, or they're not prepared to participate fully in a political society. All of those things are observations that we can see in different representations within the media. And the way that the media kind of characterizes it is that institutional trust is at an all-time low. And then the university is one illustration of that. And you're kind of saying this is what you're observing too, and perhaps this is part of why we sense this divide between what universities say they should exist for, if they know what they should exist for, and then what they're putting out. And then from the outside, we can say, well, you don't seem to be delivering on that. And so societally, what's the importance of this role? And should we trust that you're going to do what you say you're going to do? And largely people are answering no, or they're very skeptical that universities are able to do that. If you were to try to diagnose, Dave, some of the specific reasons, or let's call them tension points. So if you were to diagnose like the major tension points within higher ed, this could go either way. So within higher ed at large, or within Christian higher education specifically, because that's more what will angle these conversations towards is Christian higher ed. the guests who we'll have on are institutional leaders within Christian higher ed. So it could go either way. But what would you say are the major tension points right now?
A major tension point are the ways the institutions have responded to these cultural shifts and the tools that have kind of emerged. I'm thinking the technologies that are available. Do those technological advancements, do they work in terms of producing a kind of graduate that can withstand the pressures of culture and be a fruitful leader within the church as a result? Or are those tools ways to accommodate the difficulties of our current cultural moment, but in so doing, in that accommodation, are they even less formative than before in a real sense, and therefore the product becomes very tenuous and like chaff. So that's a major tension point that I feel. Are the tools working? Now, I get why institutional leaders have to adjust to the economic and cultural shifts in education at large, and why there's a ton of pressure to make those shifts in order to survive. I get that tension. I suppose the greater tension even in that is how we're accommodating to that. Does that work? Mm-hmm. Because I think that's what we've observed sort of in our little bitty test pool here at Fellowship Denver, our little bitty sample pool. Like the results are mixed at best.
Do you mostly see that in technological terms, Dave, or is that just one of many areas? So when you say tools, my mind goes immediately to online learning.
Right. Yes, I think that's the big one, and I feel that on both ends. One end as a professor, where I always have taught a class in person, and a couple of years ago was asked to teach online because that's where the need was and the opportunity. And I've taught online for years. The amount of effort it took compared to the fruit that was produced was so disproportionate that it didn't just make sense for me to do it anymore. And so the from my vantage point as a professor, I'm not an online manager. You know, it's a different skill set, and it's a different. What's asked of me as a professor is so different that I can see in the students taking that what they're getting is not as good. Mm-hmm. Now that's my perception. I know that there are other perceptions that the online experience can be really beneficial. A couple of years ago, I was teaching a class online, and we met together on prayer. And in one prayer session in my class, we had people in Denver, we had people in Texas, in New York, in Italy, in Germany, and in Africa in one class. And we prayed together and got a sense of understanding each other's sort of cultural background and ministry context. And that was beautiful. And we can't have that without these technologies. So I don't want to diminish that there aren't really wonderful ways to use these technologies. And even with that, when push came to shove for me, even though there were these high points, the overall impact I felt like was it didn't make the effort it required to teach it worth it, such to where I'm kind of only available now in person, you know, and again, is that more a reflection of my bias against technology? It might very well be some aspect of that. And I think there's also a universal principle that embodied educational, formational experience is necessary for the kind of depth that we need. There has to be that. So those are tension points that I experience.
Yeah, I see this tension point displayed in some of the conversations that are taking place about, just at a lower level, at an observable level, about online learning and the huge benefit of being able to reach more people, to make it more affordable, all of those things, stacked up against where the media focus often lies, which is on elite institutions. And so many of the elite institutions have doubled down on the fact that students have to come in person, that what they're offering cannot be gotten through online learning. So it's a very interesting push-pull.
It is, and with those universities, on-campus requirements for 4 years is commonplace. So it's not just you have to be, this isn't available online, it's in person, but you're living there on campus for 4 years. It's not just 1 year, it's not just a freshman. No, it's a 4-year investment. And I think there's something really powerful about that. With Will, and he's at BC, and none of his classes are available online. You can't get an online degree there. Now, are they in a privileged position to be able to do that? Well, of course. But is it also true that them doing that creates a kind of formative experience that works? I think so. And so, and my hunch is that many institutional leaders would agree with that, but that's only available to a certain percentage of institutions. And of course that's true to some sense, but if it works, if we know it works, then part of me begins to go like, okay, how can we create environments where we can have those embodied transformative experiences and molding experiences, and what is a step forward towards that from wherever any institution may be at any given moment.
So that's one tension point. The tools that are available to schools right now, or I should say that within our technological society, there are adaptations that schools have to make. And so they're kind of trying to flesh out which adaptations to the current cultural moment and the lay of the land in regard to technology and technological advances, which of those are useful for us as an institution, which are not, and what is then that kind of gets back to like what are we trying to produce?
Right.
So
what's a short-term win?
Yes.
Maybe it buys us a couple of years, but ultimately is a long-term loss.
Yeah.
And what's a reasonable adaptation that preserves what we know works for the long haul, but also is acknowledging sort of the age that we live in, the technology that is available, that isn't going anywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so that's one, which we could sum up as like, what do we do with technology? There's this tension point between online learning and in-person learning, embodied learning. What do they both produce? There's benefit and cost to both. So what's another major tension point right now?
I would say it's a misunderstanding or different expectations on the role of the university and the role of Christian higher ed in general. What is its purpose? To me, that's a huge tension. Because if its purpose is primarily to train you to do a job, to educate you to be able to be coherent in a job, then that's one thing. If it's to shape you into a certain kind of person, that's actually another thing. So are we assuming that people are fine how they are when they arrive at the institution, and we're just going to equip them with what they
just
need
skills.
They just need skills. Or are we assuming the people who come into the institution actually need to change into different kinds of people? Now, if it's the latter, then that changes our curriculum. It changes our approach to how it is professors and administrators interact with that student. It changes how we respond to criticisms, and along the way, it just is a different posture or approach. So to me, that's the major sort of issue. Now I'll tell you how one institution is like stuck right in the middle of this tension. When Will was doing all these college visits, we went to one college that was really great university, and I liked it because it, at least on the surface, had this like we're a transformative experience, whatever. And yet when we went on the tour, they had this program that Will was interested in. And then at the very end, they said, here's this program. It's laid out for you. It's a mold, as we would describe it. But they said, there's another option for you, which is totally student-driven. You can actually create your degree program. And you can shape it out how you want it. And it actually creates an opportunity for a student, and all of their wisdom as an 18-year-old, to create their own formative experience in their life. Sort of, they can prepare themselves in that program totally. And anyway, that we didn't go with that institution, but I get why they were doing it, because it's sort of the age we're living in. Like totally sort of, self-authenticating, and yet it's obviously it's not going to produce a different kind of person. Mm-hmm. It's just going to reinforce the instincts and biases of that person as an 18-year-old and then lock them in that path. It's the opposite of formation.
Huh. Is it fair, Dave, to say, after listening to that, your description there, which I think is such a good illustration of this moment in higher ed and the real tension that you're describing, is it fair to say that there's sort of a three-way tug-of-war going on? One perspective says we're shaping someone who needs a particular skill. So we're forming, you said, a worker, someone who can enter the workplace and apply for a particular job. We could say we've equipped them to do that job. So that's one reason, one purpose for college education, university education. On the opposite end of that, you're saying there's also a perspective that says we're forming a civic participant. We want to take a person who has this potential and create in them the ability to carry these characteristics into whatever field they enter. And we'll equip them too. We'll give them professional training and teach them communications. But
critical. That's a critical job in there.
But we want to form them into a person of virtue so that regardless of what job they land in, they are a good employee or a good participant in society, or that they see themselves as part of a greater whole. So there's these two. But there's a third, I think, factor that universities right now are really wrestling with, and that's the pressure that they face to help students self-actualize. So in what you were describing about you get to lay out your own degree path, I think that's responding to the cultural pressure to say, your role as an institution is to help this student discover their identity and be able to live out that identity. And that's actually the purpose of this education.
Right. And that's a very specific anthropology that's been adopted by universities, and probably not on purpose. It's just sort of become kind of default belief. And so a university or a seminary is successful to the extent that you help someone discover their best self and reinforce their identity that they're preloaded with. And now, of course, with that, there is, I think, something that's true in that. Self-discovery and developmentally in that age period, of course that has to happen. Your sense of confidence and your sense of identity, all of that has to happen. But I think the real tension, though, in that is assuming that the best self or my true self or whatever it is that universities feel self-actualized, universities feel pressure to sort of reinforce. It's assuming that self is authentic and not itself shaped by the culture. And of course, like the gig's out, it has been shaped by the culture. Mm-hmm. It's sort of a kind of a false idea. It's a culmination. All the powerful tools that are available in culture are shaping what people believe about themselves, right? So I feel like the university and Christian higher ed and seminary education is a unique place to challenge those identities and to then point to rootedness. What sort of is transcendent? What's virtuous? What are things that have lasted and endured through cultural shifts that give us a sense of what does it mean to be truly human or really flourish or have genuine connection with God? So I think that's a huge tension point.
I think what we're observing about these tensions is true both in institutions of higher learning, just in America, and then we're talking to some degree about Christian institutions. They're facing these same questions. So online learning, in-person learning, really relevant in the world of Christian higher ed. What's the purpose of education? We see these pressures being put on administrators and educators within the world of Christian higher ed. It's impacting them also. I think there's one more way, though, that cultural pressure gets applied to Christian institutions. And I wonder what your thought is, Dave, about this aspect of it. So they're facing those cultural pressures, but then Christian institutions also, in many cases, feel the cultural pressure to, in terms of their stance, their doctrinal stance, to cave to culture in other ways, kind of to give in to the zeitgeist of the moment and to compromise beliefs that they had previously held as central. So how do you see that playing out right now?
Well, I see that to claim orthodoxy, where maybe used to be not as challenged 20 years ago, is. So to me, the extent to which a university, when facing tension, to cave on certain areas of orthodoxy, what it means to be a human, issues of sexuality, in relationship to what it means to be human, our understanding of God and the gospel and the uniqueness of Jesus, all of these things that have been kind of unquestioned, more or less, in Christian teaching and orthodoxy. The pressures of culture come at institutions at such an angle and create real instability, such to where I am empathetic towards Christian leaders when they either cave or waffle, and yet to the extent that they cave and waffle, it is basically a death blow to to the credibility and the validity of that institution. So, and we can play this out. I know you and I, we've done all kinds of research, and we'll talk about this more. So really the tension is the courageous thing to do and the hard thing to do is to maintain strong orthodoxy where at these cultural tension points where you're asked to cave and you don't. The safety and security and the fruit that actually comes in institutions is on the back end of that. You've kind of proven yourself to be durable over a tension point culturally. And now I can trust you because it would have been really easy to go back on what God's word says about X, Y, or Z back then, and you didn't. I want to be like that. I want to be a kind of leader in the future that can maintain that kind of credibility and stability. So I want to be shaped by a place that itself has been able to endure those cultural vantage points. So all of that pushes sort of back to this decision point that many leaders have on to what extent will we in Christian higher ed maintain, double down even on Christian orthodoxy, and do it in a way that is that creates that stability. Now, I think there's better and worse ways to double down on orthodoxy. I think there are ways you can double down on orthodoxy that actually is anti-missional and causes all kinds of other problems. So I think we'll probably explore both ways you can go on that.
Mm-hmm. I think we will. I think we'll save that for our next conversation.
Yes.
We're going to continue this conversation. There's a through line here in that we're observing as leaders of a church, which is an institution in our city, that some of these shifts that have impacted higher ed have also impacted the church. They're in different ways. There's a nuance there, but we have a real moment as a local institution with presence in the city to respond thoughtfully and to say we actually exist also as a formative institution. That's what the process of discipleship is. And so we're asking then what is an appropriate response right now? How can we actually, what is appropriate for us to say, well, we can be part of that role? That maybe there's a greater hole left in this moment societally and in the lives of people because some of the places that they have been shaped and formed in the past aren't really doing that to the same extent or are asking, kind of departing from that model. And so next week, we're going to talk about the church's response. We'll look at this through in a number of ways. What are local churches kind of in our context doing? Some are choosing different models as a response. And what are we, Fellowship Denver, doing? And so we'll talk more about Fellowship Institute and our hope in that and actually what we're offering through it, Dave, and what your vision for the tracks you've laid out is. So thanks for having this conversation with me. I look forward to continuing it next week.
Me too.
To those of you listening, if you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.